Prime Minister, the PDAC has long regarded Aboriginal communities and their leaders as natural partners in the exploration and development of this country's wealth of natural resources, and you have visited Aboriginal communities across our country. What do you see as some of the lasting effects on communities and community members as a result of their participation in the resource sector?
Well, look, it can be, these are extraordinary opportunities. First of all, I always encourage, as we discussed at lunch, I always encourage industry to engage with people on the ground, to engage with local communities, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal communities, and not just engage from the standpoint that there are legal and process requirements for engaging, but that it's always better to do business when all lines of communication are open and when local people understand the advantages that are there for them. You know, I can give we talked about it at lunch. I was in the Meadowbank mine up in the Baker Lake area some years ago, a couple of years back, and major gold mine there, and we see the transformation it's brought about. Not just all of these people who now have access to good, well-paying jobs where there were no opportunities before, or very few opportunities, but people who are gaining skills that can be transferred and moved to other such projects in the region or farther away, because as we know, your industry is more often than not willing to actually move people towards the jobs to get those people to fill them. I think the next step for a lot of these communities, and this is what I've said to Aboriginal leaders, when you see these projects, find out about them, but don't just view them as an opportunity to get some money. View them as an opportunity for people to get jobs. View them as an opportunity for people to get training and take those jobs elsewhere. View it as an opportunity to develop entrepreneurial skills in your community so that local businesses can service the industry and can also move some of those skills to other projects in other parts of the country. And that's the thing, we see it happening in that particular region. We've seen it happening obviously in some of the energy and other projects, mining projects in other parts of the country. And as I say, these are opportunities in many places with your industry. They're opportunities that have never existed in some of these regions, have never existed before. They're not near large population centers or near other industry. And frankly, they're once in a lifetime. But if you grab the once in a lifetime, you can turn it into something very permanent.
Thank you. And you recently announced the First Nations Control of First Nations Education Act. And knowing that as you have mentioned, that our sector is facing a tremendous deficit of skilled labor over the next decade, how do you anticipate this new legislation helping to increase Aboriginal participation in the sector?
Well, this is, obviously we hope that over time this is going to have a really transformative effect. This, the First Nations Control of First Nations Education Act, which I announced with Chief Atleo of the Assembly of First Nations, this is about fundamental reform to K-12 education. Today, and I don't want to obviously run down all of the education that occurs in all Aboriginal communities, but the reality is that much of the education in First Nations communities today does not have any real legal framework around it. The schools, they may have a curriculum, but they're not necessarily curriculum that is portable to other school systems. There are no accepted standards of training or of studies that you find in other education systems, and certainly not ones that are comparable. So what we want to do with the First Nations Control of First Nations Education Act is give Aboriginal communities, first of all, much greater control within their communities of their own education, much as, you know, the rest of us have that through our local school boards, but at the same time within a framework that establishes provincially equivalent standards of teacher certification, of curriculum, of accountability and financial controls and the use of money. And so we think with this trade-off and with obviously certain investments that go along with it in teachers and in buildings and in these sorts of things, we think we're going to have in the next generation, we have a much greater possibility of having an Aboriginal workforce that is ready to be trained for the other more sophisticated jobs. I think as many of your members would know, because I know there's certainly a desire of many of your members, particularly where they're located near First Nations community, to hire First Nations or Aboriginal people. But often the barrier is the fact that these people lack basic education skills. They don't merely lack the more sophisticated skills of today's mining sector, they lack very basic skills. So we hope that through this reform, what we'll have at the end will be a generation of young people who are much readier to undertake that kind of entry into the workforce. I think it's a great look. I think this is a great innovation, and the real key is this has to be done in partnership. As you know, with Indian residential schools and other such disasters in the past, there's been way too many attempts to fix these problems by imposing solutions on First Nations. And the fact that First Nations have been, through Chief Atleo, part and parcel of the development of the system itself, I think speaks very well to its chances of long-term success.
Okay. Thank you. And if we may now talk a little bit about infrastructure, which is very important to our industry. From Sir John A. Macdonald to Diefenbaker, infrastructure investments have helped build modern Canada. And there are many regions of the country with enormous resource potential, such as the Ring of Fire, Western Nunavut, Northern Quebec. But without infrastructure, developing these mineral resources is simply not economically viable. And my economic geology prof at McGill, Wally McLean, used to say to new students as they came in that ore is something that you can be mined at a time, at a place, and at a profit. And so in order to convert resources into the ore bodies and mines of tomorrow, what is your government's vision for the use of infrastructure investments to unlock the resource potential of remote and northern parts of the country?
Well, first of all, just to back up a bit to last year's budget, Economic Action Plan 2013, we announced a new national infrastructure program for the next decade. It comes after the one we announced in 2007, which in 2007 was the largest in dollar terms in history, and this one is even larger. It's some $70 billion. Some of that is on federal infrastructure, but much of that will be infrastructure that we're sharing the costs of, owned by provinces or municipalities. It's been divided into several categories, but look, a big chunk of that is really directed towards infrastructure that we think will be of long-term economic benefit. In the case of southern Canada, in particular, I guess it's true in the territories as well, but especially in southern Canada, we will prioritize those dollars principally in collaboration with the provinces. So they will have a lot to do with deciding how much of those dollars they want put into areas like in Ontario, Ring of Fire, areas where there's obviously need for major infrastructure. Not much exists today. I know something where we're looking at in terms of northern Canada, where obviously we have special responsibilities because of our relationship with the territories, is we're trying to figure out how in many of these areas where there's very little infrastructure and there are obviously a small number of communities, how it is we can try and marry private infrastructure needs with long-term public infrastructure use. For example, what is it that we can do in terms of airports, housing, other transportation, so that if industry needs transportation and wants to make or needs infrastructure and wants to make investments, what is it we can do as a government to put dollars into that so that it serves the community, not just during the life of a project, but maybe well beyond the life of a particular project. And we think if we can find some way of marrying industry's willingness to pay for some of this and our need for some of this, we can reach, in some of these northern areas, arrangements that are beneficial to both sides.
Very good. Thank you. And along that line, Budget 2014 commits to working with territorial governments to develop transportation infrastructure in the north. Do you have a sense as to the timeline for moving forward on this, and do you see our sector having a seat at the table?
Look, we'll certainly consult widely. Look, we've made, our government, as I think you know, through our northern strategy, we have made unprecedented investments in the north. Housing investments, particularly in Nunavut, the small craft harbor we opened in Pangerton, the High Arctic research station that's taking shape in Cambridge Bay. all through the north, we're making major infrastructure investments. What has been signaled to us by many of the communities as the greatest need is something in the area of harbors and ports, where it can be easier to receive, obviously, goods, but also basis to stage commercial fisheries. So I can't give you any timelines today, but obviously we've signaled that we're interested in doing that, and we're in discussions with people in the north to get a sense of what their priorities really are.
And we certainly appreciate the extension of the GEM project, the 7-year, $100 million investment. That's very important to our membership.
Yeah, those are obviously very industry-specific projects, but they are also, as you know, at the same time, they are investments in science, and they are fundamental responsibilities of a government to really map, not just map in the traditional sense of showing a boundary or a water line, but to really map geology and other features in a very comprehensive way. And so we're very committed to doing that as part of our exercise of our sovereignty in northern Canada and that part of the world, but also for the obvious opportunities it will provide for development.
The next few questions relate to human resources and international corporate social responsibility. And we sort of touched on this before, but our sector estimates that we'll require 100,000 new entrants into the labor force over the next decade, which is approximately 1/3 of the entire workforce. And what can the federal government do to help our sector with our unique human resource needs?
Well, this is a challenge, Rod, that we have constantly, because as I've said, we believe that the biggest single economic challenge coming forward and the biggest single impediment to growth in the decades to come in Canada is going to be labor market bottlenecks. Fact of the matter is, we as a government, as a national government, federal government, are not the level of government primarily responsible for education and training. We do important investments. We do have some levers. We make large-scale transfers to the provinces for post-secondary education. We have undertaken some very specific measures to try and encourage, for instance, apprentices. We've created a number of incentives, including the Canada Apprenticeship Loan. We've done a number of things to try and encourage people to look into that area. The most recent budget announced very generous Canada student loan terms for people who want to undertake apprenticeships. So these are things we're doing that would be specific help to the industry. We also help on the research side. We fund through universities and colleges a lot of research activities, and we're making, for instance, very specific investments in Yukon College's Center for Northern Innovation in Whitehorse. We're making specific investments through our responsibilities in the territories for Northern basic adult education for those who have already left school but actually need to upgrade their skills to very basic job entry levels. So look, we're looking for ways we can do this through the Canada Job Grant. We hope now we've got a formula where we can move forward with the provinces on market sensitive training. As I say, as a secondary actor, we're trying to do what we can. The area of skills and labor force where we obviously have primary responsibility is immigration. And what we're trying to do there very gradually, obviously without losing important priorities in our immigration system like refugee protection or family reunification. We're trying to orient much of our immigration system towards economic need and towards immediate labor market need. We've been doing that through a whole range of changes, probably the most important of which is coming up, which will be the expression of interest system, where we can try and have applications that are needed in the labor force approved very quickly. But this is really what we're trying to do, both in immigration and labor market and skills, to try and encourage a labor market that's ready to create the jobs that I know the companies in this room want to create.
Thank you. On another subject, I was very fortunate to accompany Canada's Governor-General, His Excellency David Johnston, to Southern Africa and met with many Canadian exploration and mining companies. And as you know, they're very active throughout the world, particularly Africa. As an industry, we're typically the first commercial boots on the ground and consider ourselves to be good corporate citizens. What are your thoughts on the performance of Canadian extractive companies operating abroad? And what is the status of the brand, the Canada brand?
Well, first of all, I appreciate you mentioning the Governor General's travels, Rod, having had the opposition or the opportunity that you had to go with him. You would understand what a great ambassador he really is for the country. He just brings an extremely broad knowledge to all of the conversations he has with foreign leaders and foreign business people. Look, our impression is that the brand of the Canadian mining sector is pretty good in this world. You know, I have an opportunity in my travels to meet many foreign leaders, particularly in emerging economies, who have or have had mining development opportunities and have had experiences with Canadian, with other developed and with other emerging sectors. And you know, it's not to say the story is perfect, but there's very few places where the Canadian story isn't the best story. Generally, we have a pretty good reputation. I know our government's worked with the sector on corporate social responsibilities initiatives. We've had great cooperation, and as you now know, we're now working through the G8 on really international reporting standards on extractives, particularly the necessity to report payments to all levels of government, to try and encourage transparency, good development and governance practices. And I do want to thank the association for the good cooperation we've had from this industry on that. I know as we talked about at lunch, I know that these things, you know, they create, in a sense, extra reporting and regulatory requirements. But done properly and done in consultation with the industry, they also have the capacity to really enhance and entrench the established Canadian brand advantage in what is a very important international industry. So, look, we appreciate the industry's record. We appreciate everything we can do together to keep that image very strong going forward. And I think that image is one of the reasons why this conference is the biggest of its kind in the world.
Thank you. Mining is one of the few industries in Canada which is the globally dominant player, particularly when it comes to exploration. And our members do face challenges when they operate abroad, both in terms of increasing resource nationalism and securing a social license to operate. Could you speak to what initiatives might be underway to help Canadian mining industry manage both of these challenges?
Well, Rod, as I just said, and as I said in the Canadian context as well, establishing good relations with foreign governments, but in particular with the local communities in which you're operating, nothing can really replace the value of that. However, obviously, there are several things our government is trying to do in terms of opening markets. We have a range of bilateral agreements that we pursue with other countries to try and enhance our access to markets, and in the case where we have that enhanced access, to secure our legal rights in those markets. It starts with things as simple as double taxation treaties that we talked about at lunch that obviously attempt to minimize fiscal uncertainty for Canadian firms operating abroad. We're often able, in many cases, to move that up to the level of foreign investment promotion and protection agreements so that there are broadly understood rules around investment and around investment disputes. The signing of these things, well, these agreements aren't always perfect. The signing of them often is a significant signpost in terms of the receptivity of those countries to our investment. And of course, the pinnacle of all of this is the signing of free trade agreements, where we developed really very deep bilateral economic relationships for the long term. And we see the advantages of that. I could talk about some of the economies of Latin America where we've seen some of the results in terms of mining and energy since we signed bilateral trade agreements, but even the big one we just concluded last year with Europe. I mean, a lot of people outside this industry would probably not be aware that metals, mineral products have significant, not insignificant tariffs on them in much of Europe, and the immediate elimination of many of those tariffs is going to be a great thing for this industry.
So, Prime Minister, I'd like to ask a few closing questions before time's up. Your annual Northern tour has taken you to a number of interesting places, not least of which is the Raglan Nickel, and I believe you mentioned the Meadowbank gold mines. What is your impressions of these northern operations?
That's a good question. Look, I'm obviously very encouraged by them, but I've been to different ones that have had different results. And I guess what really sunk home with me is how challenging the economics are around some of these projects. They're challenging because they are in areas that haven't been opened up, whereas we've talked about there's not necessarily a lot of infrastructure, where people may not have the education or skills, where the actual technological conditions, particularly the weather conditions, are extremely challenging. And of course, there's all what you deal with every day as an industry, just the fluctuation in prices and the unpredictability that exists in the marketplace. So, you know, this is part of the reason why we're making the investments we are in mapping, in infrastructure, in training, in some of the tax incentives we've talked about earlier. Not that we as a government can solve all of these problems, but we are very alive to them. We are very alive to the challenges that exist. You know, we've been hearing, certainly I've been hearing since I was a boy, and I'm sure people older than me have been hearing even longer, what great opportunity we have in our country because of our resource and mineral wealth. But the fact of the matter is, just to have those minerals sitting in the ground is not enough. There are real economic forces at play. There's real competition elsewhere in the world. And so everything we can do to provide certainty and provide a lower cost environment, we're looking at doing that.
And there are some people who believe that mining is a sunset industry. And I'm wondering what's your vision for mining in Canada going forward?
A sunset industry in the sense of?
I guess, well, just low tech, depleting reserves, and so on and so forth. There is no upside, if you will, long-term upside to mining.
Well, you know, I'm certainly not in that camp. I think you know, I remember hearing things like this when I was a boy, 50 years ago. And in fact, there was conventional wisdom for some decades that these were declining industries with prices that would fall in the long term and resources that would become depleted or exhausted, which, by the way, are contradictory points of view. But we've seen, you know, what we've seen in my lifetime is exactly the opposite. We've seen, first of all, that demand for the products that your industry looks for and produces, that demand has over time risen and risen and risen. We've also come to understand, I think, how little we've actually scratched the surface of the globe in terms of the resources that are actually out there and in the right you know, economic and political frameworks can actually be accessed. But more than anything, because I know this through, you know, my own family and my own experiences, we know that the kinds of jobs created in this industry, the exploration jobs, the jobs around the development of modern technology, and the labor jobs, the trades and skills jobs, we know that these are increasingly high-tech, high-skilled, and high-paying. And in fact, some of the best opportunities for young people, particularly young people with, who have often had modest prospects in the past, like our Aboriginal people, there are phenomenal opportunities in this industry. So look, I think we're a long way from talking about a sunsetting on this particular industry.
Very pleased to hear that. So we have one last question, and I guess this is my question. Always very curious. you live under unrelenting media scrutiny. You have a very demanding job. How do you find time for work-life balance, which for most people in this room would just think that would be unobtainable? So what do you do? How do you cope with it?
Well, first of all, I don't seek your pity. I do say this, you know, for all the stresses and pressure on the job, and I say this to younger people, and I know our parliamentarians would say the same thing, notwithstanding their periodic complaints, that there really is no more exciting field than public service, and in particular elected public service, where you get to meet all kinds of people and you literally get to be exposed to just so many different ideas and developments and variety in the job. You know, told my kids and others, one thing about my job, I'm never bored. And, you know, it sounds trivial, but how many people are bored in their jobs every single day, if not many days? So I have a very exciting job, an intellectually challenging and interesting job. I also have, you know, I think the most interesting and exciting job in the best country in the world to have that job in. I look at, you know, I talk about speaking to the Prime Minister of Ukraine today, and, you know, I could mention, you know, we think about even the President of the United States and others and the problems that they have. I consider myself just extremely fortunate. In terms of, you know, work-life balance, you know, it's like anything else when you get into leadership or senior management positions. You just have to draw lines. There's no limit to the amount of time I could spend in this job. We could have 6 or 7 prime ministers and they would still not be doing everything that people would be asking them to do. So you have to put a certain amount of time aside for family, a certain amount of time aside for, you know, intellectual refreshment, for social life, for hobbies. I try and do that. I should put a little more time aside for health than I probably do, but I seem to be managing at the moment. So as I say, it's just a matter of discipline. It's a matter of establishing your priorities and drawing lines and saying that under most circumstances, you know, that next phone call or that next meeting just is going to be off, so that I can do some of those other things. But I haven't yet got to the stage of my father. My father, who also enjoyed his career, he was a chartered accountant and an executive in the oil industry. But he had all kinds of hobbies, and eventually said that he had to quit his job because it was interfering with his hobbies. I haven't yet got to that stage.
Very good.